the Scottish Isles. Names that conjured images of stark cliffs, relentless wind, and seas that churned with a wild, ancient power. Here, legend whispered of the Selkie, creatures of the deep who could shed their seal skins to walk on land as humans, their beauty captivating, their hearts forever tethered to the ocean's pull. For me, arriving on these remote shores felt like stepping into a ballad, a place where myth breathed with the salt spray. The agency's interest, predictably, was less poetic. A cryptic note, unearthed from their digitized archives, spoke of anomalous amphibious entities and the unique properties of shed integument. It was their usual cold jargon, a stark contrast to the mournful songs and tragic love stories that clung to the Selkie name like mist on the moors. I'd come seeking more than just another specimen for the agency's catalog. I was drawn by the profound melancholy of creatures caught between two worlds, a feeling that resonated uncomfortably with my own fractured existence. This land of myth and mist might hold answers, or perhaps just a deeper understanding of what it means to be truly lost. The ferry had deposited me in Kirkwall, but my true destination lay further out. A small, sparsely populated island in the Orkneys, accessible only by a local mailboat that ran 3 times a week, weather permitting. The journey itself was a testament to the raw power of the North Sea, the boat pitching and rolling through gray, white-capped waves under an equally gray sky. The air was sharp with salt and the cries of gulls, a bracing change from the humid density of my last investigation. This particular assignment, if it could be called that, stemmed from another of the agency's cryptic archival notes: Orkney Isles, anomalous amphibious entities. Shed integument displays unique hydrodynamic and insulative properties. Cold, clinical, and utterly devoid of the rich folklore that actually surrounded the Selkies. My own interest was piqued less by the potential for specimen retrieval, and more by the stories of creatures caught between two worlds, a melancholy that resonated. The island, when it finally emerged from the mist, was a stark tapestry of green and gray. Rolling hills dotted with sheep, rugged cliffs plunging into the turbulent sea, and scattered crofts hunkered down against the wind. A profound sense of isolation permeated the landscape, a quiet that was both peaceful and a little unsettling. My lodgings were a room in a centuries-old stone farmhouse run by a taciturn widow named Elspeth, whose eyes seemed to hold the same ancient sorrow as the landscape around us. My initial attempts to inquire about Selkies were met with a curious mixture of polite dismissal and a subtle, almost protective reticence. "Aye, there are stories," Elspeth would say, her hands busy with her knitting, her gaze fixed on the gray sea beyond her window. Old tales for the bairns, mostly. But there was a way she said it, a hesitation in her voice, that suggested the tales were more than just fireside fancy. The local pub, the only one on the island and smelling faintly of damp wool and stale ale, was a similar story. The fishermen, weathered men with faces like carved driftwood, would fall silent if I steered the conversation towards the seal folk. They spoke freely of storms and catches, of the dangers of the currents and the fickle nature of the North Sea. But the Selkies seemed to occupy a different, more sacred, or perhaps more fearful space in their understanding of the world. It was from an old fisherman named Angus, his face a roadmap of sea lanes and lost comrades, after I'd shared a few drams of surprisingly potent local whiskey with him, that I got my first genuine acknowledgement. "They're out there, right enough," he'd rumbled, his voice low, his eyes scanning the churning gray waters of the harbor as if expecting to see one. "But they keep to themselves, mostly, and it's best to let them be. Steal a Selkie's skin and ye steal its soul, and the sea always claims its own, one way or another." His words, heavy with an unspoken history, hung in the smoky air. The investigation had begun, not with a roar or a scream, but with a whispered warning and the pervasive, salty tang of the ever-present sea. Angus's somber warning about stolen skins and the sea's vengeance lingered long after the whiskey's warmth had faded. It painted the Selkie legend in shades far more complex than the agency's dry assessment of, quote, anomalous entities. These weren't monsters to be hunted or specimens to be collected. They were beings with souls, capable of love, loss, and a profound yearning connection to their ocean home. Over the next few days, I tried to absorb the island's rhythm, hoping to glean more than just direct answers. I walked the windswept cliffs, the roar of the surf a constant companion, observing the colonies of gray seals basking on the Selkies offshore. Their dark, intelligent eyes seemed to watch me with an unnerving awareness. Were any of them more than they appeared? The thought was both absurd and strangely compelling. Elspeth, my landlady, remained reserved, but she would occasionally share fragments of old songs, her voice thin but clear, melodies that spoke of longing and the sea. The lyrics, when I could decipher the thick Orcadian dialect, were invariably tragic. A Selkie man lured ashore by a mortal woman. A Selkie woman whose seal skin was hidden by a jealous husband, forever binding her to a life she hadn't chosen. Her heart aching for the waves. The music itself was haunting, imbued with the wild, melancholic spirit of the islands. "My own grandmother," Elspeth said one evening, surprising me with her candor as a storm raged outside. They said her grandmother was from the sea. She had eyes the color of a winter ocean, and she could never bide long from the shore, always listening for something only she could hear. She offered no further explanation, letting the implication hang in the air, heavy as the scent of peat smoke from the fireplace. I found a small, dusty collection of local history books in the back room of the island's tiny post office, which also served as a general store. Tucked within one, a slim volume of local folklore, was a hand-drawn map of the island, much older than the book itself. It marked several coves and inlets with crude symbols. One depicted a seal, another, a woman's figure rising from waves. One particular cove named Selkies' Haunt on the map was on a remote stretch of coastline, difficult to access. The agency's note had mentioned specific littoral zones favored by entities. Could this be one? The stories and the songs all revolved around one central tragic theme: the magical seal skin. Without it, a Selkie was trapped, vulnerable, their true nature suppressed. To possess someone's skin was to possess their freedom, their very essence. It was a potent symbol of coercion and loss, and I began to understand why the islanders spoke of it with such gravity. This wasn't just folklore. It was a deeply felt metaphor for exile and the yearning for home, themes that, in my own way, I understood all too well. The mystery of the Selkies was less about a creature to be found, and more about a sorrow to be comprehended. The hand-drawn map, with its cryptic marking of Selkies' haunt, became my new focus. The cove it indicated was on the island's exposed western coast, a treacherous area of jagged cliffs and unpredictable currents, accessible only by a narrow, winding sheep track that Elspeth warned was no place for a Sassenach in a southerly gale. I waited for a morning with a rare lull in the wind, the sky a pale, watery blue. The trek was arduous, the path often crumbling near the cliff edge, the roar of the surf a constant, thunderous presence below. The isolation was profound. Even the ubiquitous sheep seemed to avoid this desolate stretch. After nearly 2 hours, I finally spotted the cove, a narrow gash in the cliffs, its entrance partially hidden by a tumble of sea-worn boulders. A small, shingled beach lay within, sheltered from the worst of the ocean's fury. The air here was still, almost unnervingly so after the constant buffeting of the wind. Seals were a common sight around these islands, but here, on this secluded beach, there was an unusual number of them, their dark, sleek heads bobbing in the kelp-strewn water just offshore, their large, liquid eyes watching my approach with an unnerving, almost human-like curiosity. As I walked along the tide line, my boots crunching on the wet pebbles and broken shells, I noticed something that made me stop. Footprints. Not the webbed flipper prints of seals, but undeniably human footprints, bare and surprisingly delicate, leading from the water's edge up towards a shadowed alcove in the cliff face. They were fresh, the edges still sharp in the damp sand, and strangely, there were no corresponding prints leading back to the water. It was as if someone had simply walked out of the sea and vanished into the rock. My pulse quickened. This was more than just local legend. I followed the tracks to the alcove. It was shallow, barely a cave, but dry and sheltered. Inside, tucked away in a crevice, I found a small, neatly folded pile of what looked like rough homespun cloth. A simple tunic and skirt, perhaps, of a style I couldn't quite place. Certainly not modern. Beside it lay a single, carved wooden comb, its teeth worn smooth with use. There was nothing else. No sign of who had left them, or why. The musty, slightly oily scent of sealskin, familiar from the pelts I'd seen drying at the harbor, was faint but discernible here, mingling with the sharper tang of salt and seaweed. I scanned the cliffs above, the rocks around me. Nothing. The seals offshore continued their silent, watchful vigil. I documented everything with my camera, careful not to disturb the items. The agency would have wanted samples, perhaps even the garments themselves. But Angus's words about stealing a Selkie's soul echoed in my mind. These weren't specimens. They were possessions, intimate and personal. Taking them felt like a violation. As I turned to leave the alcove, a faint sound drifted from the direction of the sea. A melody, high and ethereal, almost too faint to be certain. It wasn't a bird, nor the wind. It was a voice, singing a wordless, mournful tune that seemed to tug at something deep within me, a song of profound longing. It lasted only a moment, then was lost in the crash of the waves. I left Selkies' haunt with more questions than answers, but with a growing conviction that the line between myth and reality on this isolated island was far thinner and far more poignant than I could have ever imagined. The discovery at Selkies' haunt, the human footprints vanishing into the rock, the discarded clothes, the mournful, fleeting song, had shifted my investigation from academic curiosity to a more focused, almost urgent observation. I began to spend more time near the secluded cove, keeping a discreet distance, using my binoculars and long-range camera, feeling more like a naturalist studying a rare species than an agent investigating an anomaly. Days passed with a little more than the seals' watchful gazes and the endless roar of the North Sea. I was beginning to wonder if my initial findings had been a fluke, a misinterpretation of mundane events, when my patience was finally rewarded. It was late afternoon, the sun a pale disk sinking towards the horizon, painting the sky in hues of lavender and rose. The tide was low, exposing a wide stretch of seaweed-strewn rocks at the mouth of the cove. I was concealed behind a rocky outcrop, a good 100 yards away, when I saw movement near the water's edge that wasn't a seal. Through my binoculars, I saw a figure emerge from the churning surf, sleek and dark. For a moment, I thought it was just another large bull seal. But then, with a fluid, almost impossible grace, it rose, water sluicing from its form. It wasn't a seal, it was a woman. She was tall and slender, her wet hair the color of dark kelp clinging to her bare shoulders. Even from this distance I could see she was strikingly beautiful, with a wild, untamed quality to her features. She moved with an animalistic grace, her gaze fixed on the open sea as if reluctant to turn her back on it. After a moment, she retrieved something from a crevice in the rocks, a bundle of cloth, likely the garments I'd seen before, and quickly, deftly, dressed. My heart pounded. This was it. A Selkie, in the flesh, transitioning from her seal form, the agency's, quote, anomalous, amphibious entity. She didn't venture far from the water, sitting on a flat rock, her back to me, looking out at the waves. Her shoulders were slumped, and there was an air of profound melancholy about her even from afar. I could hear, faintly, the same wordless, sorrowful song I'd heard before, a melody that seemed to be an extension of the sea itself. I knew I shouldn't approach. My presence could startle her, drive her back to the sea, perhaps forever. The agency would have wanted me to observe, to document, perhaps even to attempt to secure the shed integument if the opportunity arose. But watching her, listening to her song of longing, I felt a pang of something other than professional detachment. It was empathy. Then, disaster, or perhaps opportunity, struck. A large wave, rogue and unexpected, crashed onto the rocks where she sat, momentarily engulfing her. When it receded, she was struggling, one leg clearly trapped in a crevice, her face contorted in pain. She cried out, a sound that was half human, half the sharp bark of a distressed seal. There was no time to think. My training, my deeply buried instinct to protect, overrode any protocol. Leaving my observation post, I scrambled down the rocks towards her, shouting, "Hold on, I'm coming!" Her head whipped around, her eyes wide, startled, and the most extraordinary shade of stormy gray-green, fixed on me. Fear, raw and primal, flashed across her face. This was not how I'd envisioned our first contact. The Selkies' fear was a wild, cornered animal terror. As I approached, she thrashed, trying desperately to free her trapped leg, her eyes darting between me and the incoming tide, which was now beginning to rise with alarming speed. "Easy," I said, keeping my voice low and calm, holding my hands up in a non-threatening gesture. "I'm not going to hurt you. Let me help." She stopped struggling, her gaze still wary but the immediate panic receding slightly. Her trapped leg was clearly causing her immense pain. The rocks were slick with seawater and algae, making any attempt to free herself a dangerous proposition. Carefully, I knelt beside her. The scent of the sea, and that faint, unique, slightly oily aroma of seal, was strong. Her skin, where it wasn't covered by the rough, homespun tunic, was pale and cool to the touch. I examined her leg. The ankle was wedged tightly between two unforgiving granite boulders. "I'll have to try and shift this rock," I said, indicating the smaller of the two. "It's going to hurt." She just nodded, her jaw tight, her extraordinary eyes never leaving my face. It took several agonizing minutes of careful leverage with a piece of driftwood I found nearby, my muscles straining, before the rock finally shifted enough for her to pull her leg free. She cried out, a sharp intake of breath, but didn't make another sound. Her ankle was already swelling, scraped raw and likely sprained. "Can you stand?" I asked. She tried, but winced and nearly collapsed. The tide was now lapping at our feet. Her gaze flickered towards the alcove where I knew her clothes, and presumably her seal skin were hidden. A new wave of anxiety crossed her face. "Your things are safe," I said, hoping to reassure her. "I saw them earlier. I didn't touch them." Relief, potent and unmistakable, softened her features. You did not take it?" she asked, her voice a soft, melodious whisper, her accent thick with the cadence of the islands, yet with an underlying musicality that was uniquely hers. "No," I said. "Why would I?" She looked at me then, a long, searching gaze that seemed to pierce through my carefully constructed defenses. "Most on land would," she said simply. "The skin, it is our life, our way home." In the shelter of the alcove, as I awkwardly tried to bind her injured ankle with a strip of cloth from my own first aid kit, she slowly began to speak. Her name was Maeve. She confirmed what the legends said. Without her sealskin, she was trapped on land, unable to return to her family, to her world beneath the waves. The skin wasn't just a garment, it was an extension of her being, the key to her dual nature. To lose it, she said, her voice filled with a profound ancestral sorrow, is to be an exile in both worlds, neither fully human nor truly Selkie, a life of longing. She told me of others, of Selkies who had been tricked, their skins stolen by lonely men who desired a beautiful sea wife, or by those who believed the skins held magical properties. Some had found a measure of contentment on land, raising families. But the call of the sea, she explained, never truly faded. It was a constant ache, a yearning that shaped their every waking moment. The agency's interest in shed integument suddenly felt far more sinister. They wouldn't have cared about the soul bound to the skin, only its unique properties. As Maeve spoke, her vulnerability, her quiet dignity, and the profound sadness in her eyes solidified a resolve within me. This wasn't an entity to be catalogued. This was a person, a being deserving of protection, not exploitation. Maeve's story, told in hushed tones against the backdrop of the rising tide, resonated deeply. Her description of being an exile in both worlds, neither fully human nor wholly Selkie, mirrored my own sense of displacement. A man without a past, adrift in a present filled with monstrous realities. The agency had stolen my identity. A human could steal a Selkie's very essence. The parallels were unnerving. She trusted me, a little, after I'd helped her and shown no interest in her precious skin, which she now kept bundled protectively beside her, even as her ankle throbbed. She explained that she, like many Selkies, felt the pull of the land, a curiosity about the human world, even a capacity for love. Some chose to stay for a time, forming bonds, experiencing life ashore. But the sea was their true home, their blood, their soul. The longing to return was an immutable force. "My sister," Maeve whispered, her voice tight with a fresh wave of pain that had nothing to do with her ankle. She loved a fisherman from the next isle. He was kind. For a time. But when she wished to visit our kin in the sea, he hid her skin. He feared she would not return. Her eyes filled with tears. She has not been seen in the water for many seasons. She is fading, they say. Her song grows weak. The casual cruelty, born of fear and possessiveness, was a stark reminder of humanity's darker side. It was the same grasping nature, the agency embodied on a grander, more systematic scale. As dusk began to settle, bringing with it a chill sea mist, Maeve grew agitated. Her ankle was too swollen for her to make the difficult trek back to a safer, more concealed landing spot further along the coast. And Selkie's haunt, she admitted, was known to others besides herself. "There is one, a man from the village," she said, her voice laced with apprehension. "He watches. He collects strange things from the sea. He believes a Selkie's skin brings power, or luck." My internal alarm bells, honed by countless encounters with human avarice, began to ring. This wasn't just about protecting Maeve from the elements. A more tangible human threat was emerging. The agency might be a distant, shadowy organization, but local greed could be just as dangerous and far more immediate. "What does this man look like?" I asked. Maeve described a burly, red-faced man often seen combing the beaches after storms, known for his secretive nature and his small, cluttered cottage filled with maritime oddities. The description matched a man I'd seen a few times in the village pub, someone who kept to himself, his eyes holding a covetous gleam. His name, according to local gossip, was Finnegan. "He has been seen near this cove more often of late," Maeve added, shivering slightly despite the rough blanket I draped over her shoulders. "Since the whispers of my sister's sorrow reached the shore," it clicked. Finnegan wasn't just a collector. He was an opportunist, perhaps believing a grieving or distracted Selkie might be an easier target. The shed integument the agency sought for its properties, Finnegan likely sought for superstition and personal gain. The motive was different, but the potential outcome for the Selkie, a life of imprisonment and despair, was the same. My role had shifted again. I wasn't just an observer, or even a rescuer. Now I was a protector. And the enemy, this time, wasn't a spectral entity or a monstrous beast, but the familiar, insidious darkness of human greed. The incoming tide and Maeve's growing anxiety about Finnegan lent a desperate urgency to our situation. Her ankle was clearly too injured for her to make a swift escape, even if she could reach her hidden skin and transform. We were exposed in the cove, and night was falling fast. "We need to move you," I said, scanning the darkening cliffs. Is there another place? Higher up, more concealed. Maeve nodded towards a narrow fissure in the rock face, barely visible in the gloom. There. It leads to a small ledge, drier, safer, perhaps. Supporting her, we made slow, painful progress. Every step was an agony for Maeve, but she bore it with a stoic silence, her focus entirely on reaching safety. The ledge was small, barely enough for two, but it was above the high tide mark and offered a commanding view of the cove's entrance. Her bundled sealskin lay beside her like a sleeping child. We hadn't been there long when a flickering light appeared at the mouth of the cove. Finnegan. He carried a hurricane lamp and a gaff hook, his burly figure silhouetted against the last vestiges of twilight. He moved with a practiced confidence, his eyes scanning the beach, clearly searching. "He knows this place well," Maeve whispered, her hand instinctively tightening on her skin. Finnegan's search grew more methodical. He poked among the rocks, his gaze sweeping the shadows. When he neared the alcove, where Maeve had first left her clothes, he paused, a predatory stillness about him. Then he spotted the disturbed sand, the faint traces of our recent presence. A low grunt of satisfaction escaped him. He began to climb towards our ledge, his movements surprisingly agile for a man of his bulk. There was no time for subtlety. As his head appeared over the lip of the ledge, I stepped forward, blocking his path. "That's far enough, Finnegan," I said, my voice quiet but firm. He started, genuinely surprised, his eyes widening as he took in. Maeve huddled behind me, then narrowing with avarice as he glimpsed her bundled skin. "Well now, what have we here?" he rasped, a greedy smile spreading across his face. "A land-bound mermaid, is it? And her protector?" He hefted the gaff hook. "Step aside, friend. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me when someone tries to steal a life," I retorted. The confrontation was brief and brutal. Finnegan was strong, driven by greed, but he was no match for agency training. I disarmed him of the gaff hook and, after a short, sharp struggle that ended with him nursing a bleeding nose and a sprained wrist, he scrambled back down the rocks, spitting curses and threats of return. He wouldn't be a problem again tonight. With Finnegan gone, Maeve's relief was palpable. The immediate threat had passed. As the full moon rose, casting a silver path across the now calm sea, she looked at her sealskin, then at me. "It is time," she said softly. "The tide is right. My thanks to you, Landwalker. You have a good heart, for one so weathered." The transformation was unlike anything I had ever witnessed. There was no monstrous shifting, no grotesque contortion. As she lovingly, carefully drew the sealskin over her human form, it seemed to melt into her, her limbs elongating, her features softening, her hair becoming a sleek, dark pelt. It was a fluid, graceful becoming, a return to her truest self. Within moments, where Maeve the woman had stood, a large, beautiful gray seal with intelligent, luminous eyes sat regarding me. She gave a soft bark, a sound that held a universe of gratitude and farewell. Then, with a powerful thrust of her flippers, she slid from the ledge into the moonlit water below, disappearing into the silvered waves without a splash. I watched until she was gone, a profound sense of peace and a familiar pang of loneliness settling over me. The cove felt empty after Maeve's departure. The only sounds, the gentle lapping of waves and the distant cry of a nightbird. I remained on the ledge for a long while, watching the moonlit sea, a strange sense of tranquility washing over me. This investigation hadn't ended with a vanquished monster or a decoded agency file, but with a quiet act of liberation, a return. Before dawn, I made my way back to Elspeth's farmhouse. She was already awake, a knowing look in her ancient eyes as I entered, damp and weary. She simply nodded and poured me a hot cup of tea, no questions asked. The islanders, I realized, understood the ebb and flow of such things far better than any outsider could. Later that morning, as I prepared to catch the mailboat back to the mainland, Elspeth pressed a small, intricately woven piece of dried seaweed into my hand. "A small charm from the sea," she said, "for safe travels and for remembering." It smelled faintly of salt and that unique, elusive fragrance I now associated with Maeve. The agency's file on anomalous amphibious entities would remain incomplete, at least from my end. I had no shed integument to offer them, no data on unique hydrodynamic properties. My report would be deliberately vague, citing inconclusive evidence and the unreliability of local folklore. Let them chase their cold, clinical obsessions elsewhere. Some secrets, I now firmly believed, were meant to remain with the tides. The encounter with Maeve, with the Selkies, had been different. It hadn't filled any gaps in my lost memory, nor brought me closer to understanding the agency's grand, nefarious designs. Instead, it had touched upon something more fundamental: the yearning for home, the pain of exile, the profound connection between a being and its true nature. Maeve's struggle to reconcile her two worlds, her deep love for both, yet her ultimate belonging to the sea, resonated with my own rootless existence in a way that was both comforting and deeply melancholic. As the mailboat pulled away from the island, its rugged cliffs receding into the gray mist, I looked out at the churning North Sea. I thought of Maeve, swimming free in her true element, her sorrowful song perhaps a little lighter now. Had she found her sister? Would her sister ever find her own way back to the waves? These were questions I would likely never have answers to. The small seaweed charm felt warm in my pocket. It was a reminder that not all entities were monstrous, not all legends were devoid of truth, and not all battles were won with violence. Sometimes understanding, empathy, and simply allowing a being its freedom were the most powerful acts of all. The echoes of the tides and Maeve's haunting melody would stay with me long after the salt spray had dried on my face. And as I faced the uncertain path ahead, I carried with me a new, quieter kind of strength, gleaned from the wild heart of the Scottish seas.